All right, so I told you guys that we were going to be seeing a wave of propaganda trying to pull us back into the Afghanistan war and justifying the US's military presence all around the region and really all around the world. And I got a clip here that is basically one of the first ones that I've seen in the days following Biden's main withdrawal and the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And this is a Morning Joe clip on MSNBC where he brings on a former NATO commander, apparently named James Stavridis, and he brings him on to basically discuss how, yes, the U.S. military's involvement in Afghanistan had basically nothing to do with actually building a stable democracy or, fully suppressing terrorism in the region or any of the lies that they told us that this war was about. At the end of this, you'll see, because he basically just reveals the entire plot and how it is actually about resource control and geopolitical power, and they're trying to justify endless war in this region. So let's go ahead and hear what these freak show conservatives have to say about this.
Now, the American people, Admiral, support this move, and yet I'm still surprised at our rapid removal. Ned Price at the State Department said this wasn't abandonment, this wasn't evacuation. It's exactly what it is. And I just wonder, Admiral, how the United States of America maintains security, not just for everybody else's interest, but for our own selfish self-interest. If we can't even keep 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 troops in a country like Afghanistan, in a country like Syria, we've now figured out over 20 years, and everybody's going to be talking about what have we learned over the past 20 years. Well, we figured out how to have a really small footprint in places like Syria and Afghanistan, and at the same time, stop the Russians, stop the Syrians, stop the Iranians, stop ISIS, stop the Turks, stop everybody from advancing. What do you think about a country, what do you think about politicians that aren't willing to actually put 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 troops in hotspots when most of those troops want to be there and are upset when they're withdrawn?
The way to think about this, Joe, is leverage. In other words, what can you gain with relatively small footprint, relatively low cost in a very strategic place? I mean, look at a map. Afghanistan is parked in the middle of Russia, China, Pakistan, India. It's sitting on top of $1 trillion in rare earths and lithium, which goes in every car battery ever made. There's a lot of reason to want to keep stability in Afghanistan. By the way, starting with the fact that when it's ungoverned, it becomes a launch pad for things like 9/11. Doing it with 150,000 troops, when I commanded that mission, it had 150,000 troops. That's not cost effective. But doing it with 3,500 to 5,000 troops makes a lot of sense to me. So I agree with your premise. We are failing in keeping the leverage here. At this point, there's really no way back that I can see for the administration.
Right. So notice the framing that he just chose in that entire piece of what he was just saying. He didn't talk about the loss of American lives. He didn't talk about the loss of civilian lives. He didn't talk about anything having to do with the actual consequences of our staying indefinitely in Afghanistan. They were purely framing this from like an economic imperialist mindset. He literally asked the question, Joe, he asked the question as, why are politicians, who basically all of them within the Democratic and Republican parties already serve the military-industrial complex? Joe Biden literally has a former Raytheon board member as the head of his Pentagon, and this is a bipartisan effort, imperialism, but they're basically framing the entire discussion in terms of economic domination in this country that is literally on the opposite side of the world. I mean, it is absolutely insane how normalized this type of rhetoric is on what's supposedly this left-wing network in MSNBC. You have a guy who is literally just asking a question of a former admiral, a retired admiral, a guy who commanded NATO forces, and he's basically just giving away the entire plot. He's asking the question in terms of what would be best for our selfish economic interests, and he honestly answers. He says, this is for control over those valuable trillions of dollars in mineral resources that Afghanistan has. This is like everything that we have been telling you as leftists, have been telling you these wars were about all the entire time, right? It was always about resource control and geopolitical control, and that's exactly what he just said. He said this is about making sure that China and Russia are not able to go in and exploit the resources in the ways that we have. Joe brought up Syria. Okay, what our troops are literally guarding Syrian oil fields, right? You look at the invasion of Iraq. That was primarily for geopolitical control and control over resources like oil in the region. And this goes for every single country that we have been involved in all around the world. It's not even just in the Middle East. You can apply this same exact line of thinking to our entire history of our involvement through the CIA and through the State Department in Central and South America. You go look at Bolivia. Well, they have large lithium stores, just like he just pointed out in Afghanistan. You look at Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest stores of oil in the entire world. So it's not a mystery why the United States perpetually gets itself involved in these endless wars. It's just for resource control and geopolitical power. And here you have a guy who is in charge of all of these forces, and he's just straight up telling you that. So listen, you know, people often like to think that you're being conspiratorial when you suggest or dare to suggest that these wars were not actually being fought for spreading democracy, or in the case of Afghanistan, as people are trying to say now, as if the war was fought over women's rights. You know, now you have all of these articles that are being written, and all of these people who never mentioned the massacring of innocent men, women, and children in Afghanistan by U.S. forces. They never mentioned that over the last 20 years, but suddenly you have all of these reporters coming out, and they're all up in arms about women's rights in Afghanistan, as if that's why we were fighting in Afghanistan. It was never about any of these reasons that they're trying to sell us on now, and I appreciate the honesty from that former retired general. He obviously didn't think that it would come off in that way, but this is how normalized it is. This is how normalized imperialism has become in everyday conversations on corporate media. They are perfectly willing to just come out and basically put their cards on the table and explain to everyone at face value, yes, we are fighting these endless wars, not for, you know, necessarily the safety of the American people, because if you want to go and look at the actual history of Afghanistan, well, who created the Taliban in the first place? Who was funding the Mujahideen to then go fight against the democratic socialist government that was in Afghanistan, and to fight against the Soviet Union's occupation in Afghanistan? Well, that was the United States funding the Mujahideen fighters. We were arming them, giving them resources, and then the Mujahideen turned into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, the United States directly funded and helped Osama bin Laden himself, and then we turn around and we act surprised when there's instability in the region. And he calls for stability in the region, but what he actually means in that clip is stability in terms of how U.S. corporate interests can exploit the resources and the labor of all of these different countries that we are involved in. And again, I appreciate the honesty, because this is basically everything that leftists tell you all the time in terms of economic imperialism and how global capitalism works. This is how it works, and there's a former admiral, a commander of NATO forces, telling you exactly what we've been saying this entire time.